Kamala's an ex-cop. She might try and take a more sort of tough on law and order approach than other Democrats would. So she's going to see, if there's unrest across the streets of major American cities, if the streets of the capital are filled with protesters burning American flags, that's going to massively damage that impression that she might try to get across.
Last few hours, Joe Biden made his first White House address since stepping aside as the Democratic presidential candidate. He explained why he's no longer running.
I revere this office, but I love my country more. It's been the honor of my life to serve as your president. But in the defense of democracy, which is at stake, I think is more important than any title. I draw strength and I find joy in working for the American people. But this sacred task of perfecting our union is not about me. It's about you, your families, your futures. It's about we, the people. And we can never forget that.
Well, could you see Joe Biden's heel marks in the Oval Office carpet where he'd been dragged to his chair? Let's ask Anthony Blair, a senior reporter at the US Sun. Anthony, this isn't something Joe Biden wanted to do. Was that clear in his speech?
Good morning, Rosie. And yes, as you say, it was a surprisingly cold address, really, given the sort of magnitude of it. There were it was more noticeable in what wasn't said than what was. Biden didn't really discuss his health in any meaningful way or talk particularly about why he stood down. He didn't mention the word COVID, didn't mention the words Donald Trump. And it seemed that there was maybe a slight tone of bitterness in his, at one point in his words, he did say, I felt that my record merited a second term, almost making clear that, if it was up to him, he would stand again, but he maybe feels that, he no longer has the support of his party and he has no choice but to step aside.
The language is kind of about, I'm going to pass the torch to a new generation. We didn't actually get clarity on, you sort of hinted at it there, why he's decided to say, well, that won't be me.
Yes, no, exactly. And while he was full of praise for Kamala Harris, who is his the next Democrat candidate in all but name now, there wasn't really any, it was mostly about his own record, and that might make things harder for Kamala. Some might say that, she is now essentially, the first few days of her campaign, we've sort of seen her try to stand on her own, if you like. But Biden's speech sort of made it very clear that Kamala is going to be standing on his record. He's saying that I've created the best economy, the best US economy in decades. I've defeated COVID. I've, beaten big pharma, as he put it. So it may make things harder for Kamala to really stand aside, to stand forward as someone that isn't just Joe Biden's successor.
Yeah, to sort of get out of his shadow. I mean, someone who is can muddle their words, but is much more direct. Donald Trump was speaking just a few hours before Biden made that address and said it was very clear Mr. Biden dropped out because he was losing badly. I mean, that is a difficult thing to get away from.
I mean, yes, and it was quite a vintage Donald Trump speech, coming just a week after, or less than a week after his address at the RNC, where he said he was going to strike a more conciliatory tone. We really saw a vintage display of Donald Trump's sort of braggadocio and kind of vivid language, if you like, describing Joe Biden. But yes, I mean, this is very hard it's very hard to remove the sense, to get away from the sense that this was the end of an era. Biden in the Oval Office, surrounded by his family, Jill, Hunter, and this sense that he feels that he could have stood again. He's the one with the proven track record who's beaten Donald Trump before, and yet as he said, he kind of got in that jibe about the age, which I think is quite significant, about passing the torch on, giving over to a younger generation that will hopefully, in his view, defeat Donald Trump.
What the Republicans keep saying from their advertisements, and Donald Trump referenced it again before Biden was speaking, was saying Kamala Harris was complicit in covering up what was Biden's, I'm quoting Donald Trump here, obvious mental decline. I mean, that's also tricky for her to navigate.
Well, absolutely. And, that's a very difficult issue for all the senior Democrats to get away from, because they all, did line up to say, no, he is, up until a few weeks ago, they were all saying he's in perfect health. We're having to keep up with him. He's, fitter than a man, decades younger. So again, that will be a very easy stick for the Republicans to beat Kamala and the Democrats with, and say like, well, if we can't trust you on, the health of the commander in chief, what else can't we trust you on?
Meanwhile, the business of running America continues. Biden today is expected to meet with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House at a fairly tense time. I mean, we're hearing lots of protests in Capitol Hill, describing Netanyahu as a wanted war criminal. How sensitive is that meeting going to be later?
Oh, incredibly sensitive. And as you said, we've seen huge protests in DC. We've seen protesters burning American flags. We've seen effigies of Netanyahu and Biden. And even in Congress, we've seen it was boycotted by 50 Democrats, including, although not necessarily a boycott, but she wasn't there, Kamala Harris. But yes, I mean, this is incredibly sensitive, and it's a very difficult issue for the Democrats to navigate because, the left of the party is much more likely to be anti-Netanyahu's visit, and they will struggle to. It's difficult to say how big an issue this is in terms of cutting into Middle America, cutting into the sort of marginal key states that the Democrats have to win in November. But there is a sense that if they do come across as a party divided on this issue, particularly in the run-up to the DNC next month, then it could be damaging.
And we would assume that Kamala Harris takes a harder line on this than does Joe Biden.
I mean, I don't know if we can assume that. I think her view on it, I think her views on this are not particularly, she hasn't particularly spelt her views out on this yet. Obviously, she wasn't present for Netanyahu's address of Congress. She was speaking at a pre-planned event at a sorority in Indianapolis. But I think, there will probably be a sense that she has to maybe make her stance quite clear and, navigate this difficult issue in the coming weeks, at the very least to stop it being something that really does just drag on through the election campaign.
If you can sort of explain to us the scale of the protests and the demonstrations, and burning flags always looks dramatic, but how much do you think it's actually reflective of a groundswell of opinion?
Well, this has been rumbling along for a few months. We saw student protests across college campuses in America, starting in Columbia in New York, and then kind of spreading across the country. And it's an issue that does affect particularly a lot of younger people. It's seen as something that is, this is a very divisive issue. Um, but again, I wonder how deeply this does cut into the sort of everyday American issues. I think if you asked a random cross section of Americans from all across the nation, I don't think that many of them would say that Israel Palestine is the biggest issue for me. But like I said, it's Kamala's an ex-cop. She might try and take a more sort of tough on law and order approach than other Democrats would. So she's going to see, if there's unrest across the streets of major American cities, if the streets of the capital are filled with protesters burning American flags, that's going to massively damage that impression that she might try to get across.
Clearly. Anthony, thank you. Anthony Blair, senior reporter at the US Sun. And we're expecting Joe Biden to meet with Netanyahu at the White House a little bit later today.